So I guess we can start now. Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the sunny weather if you're in Toronto. Today, we're pleased to have Dr. Brendon Hemily in our seminar series. He's been involved in many projects over the last 3 decades related to use of transit data and analytics. He was co-organizer of TransitData 2020 International Symposium on the use of public transit automated data hosted by Transit Analytics Lab last summer. Same as previous seminars, this is a 40 minutes presentation followed by 10 to 15 minutes of discussion, and you can use the chat box to ask your question, or you can raise your hand and we will give you the permission to turn on your audio. Dr. Hemily, it's an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mustafa. So my name is Brendon Hemily. We're going to do this a little bit differently. Ala is going to advance the slides, but just a quick little bit background. So I've been working with Amr, Professor Shalabi, on the Transit Analytics Lab. I've sort of been involved in public transportation research, applied research for a long time. I started an academic career at Columbia in economics and MIT in planning and transportation, and then worked organizing training courses, but took an interesting turn where I was offered a job at the Canadian Urban Transit Association, CUTA, which is the professional association for transit agencies and suppliers and consultants, government agencies in Canada. I worked there 15 years, working closely with the transit agencies to develop an applied research program and also manage the national statistics that are collected by CUTA. And I've been an independent consultant now for 20 years, working in both Canada and the US on applied research. And the whole topic of data and the use of automated data is something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And in talking with Amr, I should also mention, I'm also been very involved in TRB, and I hope all of you know about TRB. I was the past chair for many years of the Public Transportation Planning and Development Committee, emeritus member, and I'm currently the chair of the Public Transportation Group, which has 13 committees within TRB. And my involvement in TRB is really significant because TRB is a forum that brings together researchers, but practitioners in all sorts of modes, as well as consultants and government agencies. So it's really a forum that looks to encourage the research that's applied and the deployment of innovation through research. So I've been very excited to work with Amr with the Transit Analytics Lab, and in discussing potential topics, I usually do one seminar a year for this UT-ITE series. And this year, though, we thought it might be useful with the launch of TAL to discuss more practical perspectives that you might not get normally with your research studies. And so it's a bit of a more trying to provide a more realistic perspective of some of the challenges. So Ala, next slide, please. So I'm going to give a historical perspective about the development of transit data, so the arc of how it has developed. And then I'm going to go into some detail about the challenges of why data is not used as much as one would hoped by the industry. And I have slides about data analytics research themes that come from the symposia that have occurred over the years in my observation of TRB, but I may or may not get to that. The challenges is the main heart of what I want to talk about today. Next slide. So just to recap, I hope everybody here knows about all this, but just to make sure, what data are we talking about? Well, on automated data. So computer-assisted dispatch, automatic vehicle location is the heart of the operational systems that transit agencies use. I just put for reminder, I'm sure all of you know this, but it is not just GPS location, it's using GPS data information and then applying it to a number of operational applications. The other data sources are automatic passenger countings, APCs, automatic fare collection, AFC. In this case, today we're talking primarily about smart card data or account-based AFC. Other data sources, transit signal priority, general transit feed specification, GTFS, vehicle health, mechanical alarms, about engine performance. And increasingly, some of you I know have worked on these things, location-based data using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi traces, social media, and crowdsourced data. And of course, there's metadata that goes with all of this. So I'm going to be using the acronyms. Just thought it would be useful to reiterate what the acronyms mean. Next slide, please. So, next slide. To start off with, all of you are too young to really realize this, but the AVL systems, the ITS systems that are in place today actually started back in the 1980s. They started first in Europe and then in Canada a bit later and a bit later in the US. The heart of these systems, the CAD AVL systems, were developed primarily for security and incident management purposes. Before that, if a driver or passenger was ill, or if there was an accident, or if there was an assault, there was no way of communicating to emergency services location of the vehicle in order to expedite getting the services there. They would have to go out and find a payphone or somebody's house. So that's why these systems were developed first with radios, with emergency alarms, and to really be able to manage incidents more effectively. So this was really operations driven, and the transit industry, and I'll come back to this, is really an operations driven industry and relies heavily on standard operating procedures, SOPs. So that's in the title, that's where the SOPs come from, because that is the normal way the industry works. But at CUDA, I organized the International Conference on AVL back in 1988. And this was the first theme-specific conference that really focused on ITS data. But one of the sessions actually, way back then, realized that the AVL data might be valuable for planning purposes. And that led to managing a report on the use of AVL and APC data for planning and management back in 1991. And I've been monitoring the development and use of data since then. In the mid-90s, first AVL systems started to appear in the US, and the focus again was on security. And there have been some significant research projects, TCRP Report 113, led by my colleague Peter Firth, and I was on the team trying to encourage suppliers to provide modules, to provide data, provide the data from the systems. And TCRP 126, which looked at the ITS data, use of it for market research. Next slide. So this is just to show how far back this dates. This is from the 1991 report, where the consultants who prepared the report collated data for where AVL APC data was being used for different applications. This is applications that were identified in some transit systems at the time for the use of the data for planning purposes, and there were three categories: executive data, planning data, and operations-based data. But although the interfaces were not fancy or very pretty, and mostly tabular, some agencies had realized what you could do with the data. The basic functionalities such as on-time performance and boardings and the lightings and so forth. Next slide. But it's taken a long time, because since then I go to a lot of conferences, CUDA, APTA in the US, UITP, TRB, ITS Canada. It's taken a very long time for the industry to start having some significant use of the data. But this is progress has been occurring in recent years. think there's a growing realization that data is a valuable resource. It has the potential to create information that enhances effectiveness and efficiency. The data is growing in importance as a strategic resource in decision making. You can see the kinds of terms that people are using: decision support systems, open data, big data. And last year, and continuing today, data played a very, very important role in helping transit agencies pivot to respond to the COVID crisis. Next slide. So what's changed? Why is there now starting to be more use of data? Well, first of all, the ITS and AFC data are more mature. Systems are more mature. They're providing easier access to data. Finally, it's taken a long time, but the last, I guess, starting at last 8-10 years, suppliers have been providing data reporting modules that make it a little bit easier for transit systems to access the data. There are some remarkable new visualization and analytic tools, and there's an increased discussion of use cases. This also coincides with a more general societal discussion of big data, smart cities, and so this has led to some increased management interest. Next slide. But many challenges continue. So as part of my efforts as a consultant, I had actually worked to support the U.S. Department of Transportation in Transit ITS matters, organizing committee meetings, workshops, and putting together discussion papers. And one of those, it's a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, so 6 years, was specifically on the use of Transit ITS data, where I tried to look at the uses, but also the challenges. So a lot of this presentation relate to the challenges I identified in that discussion paper. And anybody who has a keen interest is welcome to send me an email. You can't find it online right now, but it tried to summarize in 20-odd pages the key challenges of why. The question I was asking is, why is it so hard for transit agencies to use data? And I don't know how many of you are working on TAL projects with AMR, but if you've had to, you've probably spent many frustrating hours trying to clean up the data. But what I'm going to go through and identify, next slide, Hala, 4 categories of challenges of why transit agencies are not using data as much as they are. So this is where the second term in the title comes from, DRIP. They now are data rich, but information poor. They have lots of data, but there's still most agencies, I would say, are still struggling with getting the data into a situation where they can use it to move towards business intent and data-driven decision-making. So these are the 4 categories. So next slide. The most important one, I think, from my personal perspective, is the lack of interest or understanding, I should say, not just by senior management, but also by the policy boards or politicians on the committees that oversee transit agencies. There are many technical issues, and I'll come to those, but this is an organizational issue, human issue. Transit industry is, as I mentioned, operations driven. It works in the public sphere, so it is very constrained in what it can do. It has to fulfill expectations in the political realm, public realm of transparency and accountability. It is what the politicians really expect, and why the kinds of managers they hire is they want to come up with a plan that is good enough for the amount of money they're willing to spend, and just try to deliver that service plan as consistently, as reliably, as safely as possible. they're really not looking to optimize. This is sort of inherently, I guess, in opposition to what academics do, which is always looking, especially engineers, to look for solutions that optimize delivery, whether it's efficiency or effectiveness. In the public realm of actually delivering service, innovation inherently involves risk taking. If you're in the private sector, you can take those risks because if you lose the money, well, maybe you'll lose your job, you'll be kicked out by the board of directors, maybe not. There have been lots of situations where banks have been rewarded even though they've lost billions of dollars. But in the public sector, it doesn't work that way. If you take a risk and it fails, you've lost your job. And so transit policy boards and management tend to be inherently risk averse. So this really means that it's really hard to promote innovation in the industry, and it takes a long time for the management, policy boards and management to be convinced that something is worth changing, is worth innovating on. So a lot of the problems come from there. Design, so as I mentioned, to start off with, the systems that were put in place, automated systems, are operations driven. From a senior management policy board point of view, there's confusion over what the benefits really are of these systems. There are interdepartmental conflicts, which make it even more difficult. There's issues of single source of truth issue. I'll give you an example. You can count riders either through passenger counting systems that count actually each person boarding or alighting, or the more traditional way of counting ridership in Canada is to use the fare box or the fare collection system. So you count the money and then you divide by the average fare that people pay, and that gives you revenue riders. It doesn't count boardings, it counts people going from linked trips, starting from their starting point to where they're getting off. So it actually counts the number of rides being taken. Well, as you can imagine, both of those systems have their own inherent issues, and you can have easily a conflict by saying, well, which is the correct report, which is the correct system, which is the system that correctly reports ridership. And then there's issues that because it wasn't viewed as important, there's a problem with just ownership of data and the lack of internal resources. If policy boards and senior management don't view data as important, they will not invest in the sophisticated tools or the business analysts or the data scientists that are needed to use to use that data. And I'll give you an example of the ownership of data. I'll come back to that later on, but because it was not viewed as important, most AVL systems, when they were being procured, did not specify that the data belonged to the transit agency. And so when mobile applications started appearing about 10 years, 12 years ago, there was a rude awakening, because the vendors in many cases had said, well, if the transit system is not asking for the data, we'll just slip in our standard clause saying the data belongs to us. And so when transit agencies wanted to start using the data for mobile applications, putting it on portals with APIs and letting third parties use it for real-time information, for schedule information, or real-time information, they had to start paying license fees because they hadn't been aware that the data had value. Now, I think that problem, as new systems are procured, replacement systems, that problem is going away. But it shows you an example of an outcome from the lack of interest and understanding by policy boards and senior management. Next slide. And beyond that, then there are technical issues, and there are first of all lots of very standard IT type challenges, data storage and lack of data retention policies and lack of systematic inventories of databases. And special legacy, special purpose spreadsheets and databases. I did an inventory for a medium-sized transit agency once to look at how they could use data, and so it involved doing an inventory of kinds of planning and operations data sources, and discovered that one of the sources of data, I think it was a spreadsheet on bus shelters, was maintained by Joe. It was Joe's spreadsheet. And everybody knew that if they needed to find information about the bus shelter, they went to Joe. Well, as you can imagine, what happens when Joe retires? Only Joe knows what's in that data, what's in that spreadsheet, how was it put together. And so, I say this sort of facetiously, but I've done, workshops where I've mentioned this, and people raise their hands and says, no, it's not Joe's data spreadsheet, it's Dave's spreadsheet. In our case, it's Dave. And so I just, I know this is a challenge. It's disappearing slowly as more and more data is automated, but it's still something that I'm sure that people do not know all the data sources they have. And this goes, partially is because there's not an integrated warehouse approach to managing the data. There are proprietary data formats, and there's a lack of clarity concerning policy procedures with open data. Next slide. And then there are things specifically that affect transit agencies. So, and then the quality of the data that they get from their systems. For example, there is still no standardized methodology for measuring the accuracy of APC systems, for accepting those systems. There's incomplete APC sampling. There's missing or corrupted data that can be caused by various reasons. It could be the sensors on board, it can be the storage of the data on board, it can be the download of the data, it can be matching in the back end. But the suppliers, to date, often do not provide any diagnostic tools that help determine the cause of missing or corrupt data. So if you have a sophisticated IT group and you have access to the logs of the data, maybe you're in a better position to work it out. But many transit agencies are not, neither have the expertise nor even have access to the individual data logs. They rely on the already processed data that's provided by the suppliers. Next slide. And then there's issues of data quality, matching and cleaning, and I suspect some of you have dealt with this issue. It's getting better, but it's taken a long time. It takes a long time for most agencies to deal with this. Imprecise geocoding of bus stops, multiple bus stop inventories and bus stop IDs. There may be different bus stop inventories and IDs for the APC system, for the AVL system, for the the destination sign system, for the location of stops and shelters, and then you get into sorting that out can be a mess. The more fundamental issue is data matching problems between the scheduling and CAD AVL systems. Each of them have a way of dealing with the routing and scheduling of the buses or transit vehicles. But there's specific things. Where is the layover location very specifically? What happens if the bus keeps on moving because it needs to park somewhere else and does a loop and comes back? Loops in transit agencies are really problematic, as are branches. And then you have issues of negative loads. Well, it counted a lot of, a certain number of people got on, but all of a sudden you find that more people got off. So the number is actually a negative number, or issues about driver getting on and off at the end of the line. Multiple sources of GPS location, how they factor up samples, linking the data to schedule and actual service, and adjusting to ever-changing schedules or moving bus stops, things of that sort. Next slide. And then challenges once the data is actually cleaned. I mentioned supplier ownership of the data was an ongoing problem. It's less so today. A lack of internal expertise. This is a core problem. Do you actually have staff that that understand data management? That's probably, you have IT folks, but people that know how to mine and visualize data. Where should they be located? Are they in IT? Are they in planning? Are they in operations? Do you have a good business process mapped out so that people understand what they're using the data for? And then just lack of support, lack or poor quality vendor tools, lack of standardized methodologies for data mining, analysis, visualization, lack of training, and mapping of the data to business processes. And then just to throw in the bad day challenge. You have one day of huge snowstorm. If you use the data for dashboards for reporting to the public, do you include that or do you not? And how do you deal with that? Or how do you extract that data if you do not want to use that in part of your averaging? Or how do you extract it if you do want to do analysis on it? Next slide. So that gives you, I think, a pretty good feeling of all the challenges that transit agencies have had to address as they're trying to set up ongoing, consistent quality assurance programs. Then we get to the whole world of new modes and new world that have appeared in the last 10 years and are increasingly part of the fabric of urban mobility. Private sector modes that are not in the public sector, jockeying and market positioning, which continues today, buying each other out or going under. They continue. The vast majority of them still haven't turned a profit yet. It's they rely on venture capital. Will they be there tomorrow, or in what shape? Government agencies have been trying to deal with this with changing regulatory regimes, trying to figure out how to handle these new modes. And lots of competition, and in some cases, very uncertain business models, as I mentioned, since they're not making profits. So they're here today, gone tomorrow, or swallowed up with ever-changing names of organizations. Next slide. But from a data point of view, that really makes it even more complicated, because now you have a shifting mobility landscape. Data is private and is a key asset, and positioning of stations and bikes, the efficiency to reposition bikes, operating conditions, identifying origin, destination, market segments. Yes, I'm sure it's gotten a lot better in the last 2 years or so, but for a long time, modes like the TNCs just did not want to share data. I mean, they would give little snippets of data, and I think they finally recognized that if they're going to be part of the urban mobility landscape, they have to participate. And I know that UT in particular has done well with working with the City of Toronto to look at the data and what the outcomes of analyzing this data. So like I said, it may be feasible. It has been feasible, I shouldn't say maybe. It has been feasible in a growing number of cases to negotiate some access to the data. And to try to make sense of all this process, there's been development of standards, the MDS, Mobility Data Standard, that's been used in LA and number of other cities to try to monitor the use of these new modes. And there's a general bike standard specification, sorry, and so it's getting better. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly so I can allow time for questions. But I have done some monitoring of the research, the applied research that's tried to look at transit data analytics and try to identify research themes. Next slide. So the I developed in that discussion paper typology, and I think kind of tweaked it over the years. But it sort of shows the different applications of the data. The data can be used for systematic monitoring at a very high level, for dashboards for external consumption, in some places, or executive management, KPIs, key performance indicators, alarms, and so forth. A lot of the data is used for service and operations planning. On-time performance and schedule adherence is one of the core functions that transit agencies use the data for. Running time analyses, operator performance, looking at the specific performance of specific operators. Strategic analysis, campaigns, major redesigns. I'm sure you've heard, well, some of you have probably heard that there's been a number of transit agencies that have tried to rethink their transit networks by focusing more on frequent transit networks along key corridors. Having data is critical in those kinds of analyses. And tactical analyses, looking at data delays by intersection, looking at how that can form locations for priority treatment, whether it's TSP or physical priority. Excessive stop dwell time and what you can do about that, stop consolidation. Exploratory data mining for safety analysis, and looking at accessibility and equity and access to health. I know that Amer and Steve Farber have looked at that quite a bit. And just starting looking at data in a more real-time environment for decision support for operational control, monitoring bunching and gaps to proactively put in standby buses or vehicles dealing with disruptions. That's just starting to happen. Next slide. So there's been a small number of academics, growing number of academics that have looked at using data, and I've been lucky. I was asked by Nigel Wilson to be, I guess, one of the token non-academics involved, and they've had a number of these TransitData workshops in 2014, 2016. Each one started with smart card data, then expanded to include AVL APC data, and looking at operations-based applications, increasingly looking at new forms of data, passive data, new applications, travel behavior, and this led to the major symposium that we organized this summer, where we made a big effort to try to bring in practitioners as well as academics, and we were very successful. About 2/3 of the participants were actually practitioners. And I wouldn't say the majority of transit agencies are there yet. It's still it's slow progress, but it's happening. Next slide. So I'm just going to zip through these. We can maybe another time talk about them in more detail. But some of the research that's been taking place is methodological, in particular methodologies for inference engines for origin destination tables, and a lot of analysis of capacity versus scheduling and some optimization. Next slide. And then practical analyses, looking at OD patterns to reveal demand, looking at accessibility, looking at travel behavior, sources to delay, on-time performance, pass-ups when buses are so full that they don't even bother, they don't stop anymore to pick up passengers, service planning, optimization. Next slide. New horizons have been what happens in cases of disruption, monitoring crowding and where passengers move. And I know some research has been taking place at U of T on looking at what's the role of TNCs in this when disruptions occur. Service quality, predictive analytics, and that was very used in responding to the pandemic, using historical data to sort of show which were the routes and runs that were going to be most likely to be crowded, so that to assist passengers in making choices about their level of comfort and safety. And opening up dashboards are just starting to happen, as I mentioned. Opening up ITS data beyond real-time passenger information, and then use of passive data and social media. Next slide. Actually, this sort of new social media data use of it is newest. That's really part of the newest horizon. So, and I know there's this project here about ongoing about using Twitter data and trying to use it both for past performance as well as incident management, or incident detection more exactly. Looking at emotional behavioral analytics and the COVID response, visualization, real-time crowding monitoring, and so forth. But also dashboards for the public, accessibility, sort of a policy perspective, a quality control of the data, data management, collaboration with academics and practitioners. That's part of the objective of TAO. Next slide. So I think I'll wrap up here with one of the things I'm really excited to see more and more effort to link analysis of performance, measurement of performance, with measurement of experience and satisfaction. We've always focused on the right-hand side of this graph. This graph comes from a standard, a European standard on quality of service in public transportation that was developed in the, now 20 years ago. But we're just getting to the point where the data is giving us insights into linking performance with satisfaction. And I think that's really important because people, how they experience transit and what encourages them to use it is only partially reviewed by the some objective analysis of the performance. It's really the experience, their own personal experience, that directs people's behavior. Next slide. So I would like to thank you all. I'm available for time for questions. And if anybody wants the discussion paper, just pop me an email and I'd be glad to send it to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hemily. So we have 15 minutes of time for discussion. If you have any questions, please use the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll give you the permission to turn on your audio.
Yeah, Amr.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brendon. Quite comprehensive, as usual, very insightful. So one of the big issues, and I'm sure you already alluded to this, is really that there's no framework or mechanism by which transit agencies can share data with others. And it's really on a case-by-case basis. Different agencies share data in a different manner and way. There was even this issue, I think, was recognized by the TRB. There was a recent report on data sharing. So if you can just speak to this a little bit more, because it affects, I think, many of us.
Okay, well, there's a couple of aspects to it. It depends a little bit on what the objective is. Why, why would they share data? Why should they share data? I'm a big believer in open source and open data, but as you can see, transit agencies operate in a public environment, which I would refer to as a fishbowl environment. Everything they do is out in the open, and every mistake they make is in the media the next day. It's totally contrary to private firms, which can be, hide everything. Which is exactly why it was so difficult to get data from Uber and Lyft. What the politicians, what they really don't want are people, calling them and complaining. And so I think there's a natural tendency to be a little secretive and not share data. On the other hand, there is a growing movement and growing recognition of the benefits of open data. How far an individual transit agency takes this depends on the leadership, on the sophistication of the policy board and of the management that they hire. So some agencies like New York and Boston share an incredible amount of data because they've come to benefit from it. But I'll give you a little anecdote. New York was one of the worst in terms of not sharing data. I mean, at the beginning, when people were, in the old bad days, when people would scrape data, schedule data off, they would launched, the MTA was launching their lawyers against those people. Well, the reaction went viral, and they did, in the end, 180 degrees turnaround where they became one of the most open agencies with the most open data. Again, how much data and what's the right balance, what's appropriate or what's not is a challenging policy decision. And I think Canadian transit systems are generally, well, let's say, how can I put this? There are more agencies I see in the US right now that are trying to pursue open data policies than I see in Canada, but I think it is happening more and more. So that's it. We're moving in the right direction, but that's not, you know, that's not the purpose of why academics want data. They want data to be able to do their analyses. And you know, there's a case where one has to come up with a collaborative approach where, you know, there's an exchange of benefits. There's a mutual benefit, so that in the past, you know, academics would have a tendency just to knock on the doors of the transit agencies and sort of say, oh, give me your free data and I'll find something interesting to publish in a journal you'll never read. You know, that doesn't do very much because there's no such thing as free data. Everything takes time to clean or to prepare. So I think it's getting a lot better. From the symposium, we saw a number of places which have a collaborative approach. That's one thing, but there's always going to be a challenge that the, you know, of mistrust, because transit agencies have been burned so many times. When I was at CUDA managing the statistics, you know, I would get requests from academics and from the media. Oh, you know, I'm from Vancouver, but I would like data from Toronto. And you ask why? Well, it's because I know that Vancouver is inefficient and I want to use the data from Toronto to show how inefficient they are. And then the people in Toronto would ask for the Vancouver data for exactly the same reason, reverse. So it's, and given all the quality assurance problems I just mentioned, you know, there's always going to be a issue of building that trust and finding those mutual benefits. So I think we're moving the right direction. The whole real-time information and mobility as a service has led us in this direction, where there's more and more real-time data that's on portals that's made accessible to third parties through APIs. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but as everything, as I've mentioned, you know, everything's just a slow progression. Is there any, I'm trying to look. Yeah, you're welcome. It's a little hard. I would ask a question. How? Oh, sorry. It looks like there is one. No, that's just thing. I would ask a question. How many of the participants here have actually struggled with cleaning data from transit agencies? Raise your hands if you so. Oh. I hope those who have you know, have.
Yeah, I can tell you there are a lot more than just Bill.
I would think so, but engineers tend to be too shy.
Yeah.
It's too bad we can't be more interactive here, because I would be curious to see. I'm always willing to see if you know, challenge my my messaging to see maybe things have gotten much better. But I can't tell from the way this is set up whether anybody here is. I know Bill, but I don't know anybody else that might be from a practitioner as opposed to a researcher.
Yeah. I see Tony from Burlington Transit. I don't mean, Tony, to put you on the spot, but you've been on both sides of academia and now in the industry, working extensively with data. Do you have any thoughts or questions to share?
Well, it has to do with the way their systems are configured too, because it's, yeah, one challenge with pulling data is that it resides in all these databases. It takes a lot of time to do it, and I guess academics, I guess the challenge is they don't necessarily know how it works, so they don't know what they're asking for.
Right.
I guess I've had another problem, which is an interesting one, is that I've asked, we've offered once to put it in the format that they want, but I was told, I'm not going to name the academic institution, but that it's a proprietary model, so they can't share it. So
yeah, that doesn't help.
The format they need.
Do you feel that I was a little hard on vendors? Do you feel things are getting better from that point of view? In terms of support and diagnostics, I mean, I still don't hear about much diagnostics that helps when there's corrupt or missing data.
Well, I think it's, I mean, it's automated data, but it's automated in quotes because, right, for a snowstorm event, somebody has to observe it and log it in there. And
yeah,
like,
sort of.
when an accident happens and a supervisor goes on the field, do you really want to ask them, put it in the SOP to make them say, okay, now write a diary of what happened so that when you do a signature, it shows a flag.
Yeah, it's funny. I still don't perceive that the decision support systems. You would think that the dispatcher would automatically have access to, a pop-up email or a pop-up log that would, with a choice of what. I think that's gotten better, but it's really still hard to analyze those logs after the fact. Oh, got something from Bill here. So I guess I'm still right. Well, that was the early 90s, so maybe there are less of Joe's spreadsheets. I still think there's some around. Yeah, I mean, everybody can see the chat, right?
Yeah.
Well, but even the Presto, I mean, that's good, but the Presto's taken a long time to get the business, intelligence modules up and running. Everything takes time. There's no question about it. Anyway, Amara, if there's no more questions, we can end up there. I hope it was practical, provide some practical insights, and if you ever have to work with transit agencies, some of the challenges that they face on their side on the fence.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hemily. It was a very interesting presentation. The recording will be available shortly on the website, so everyone can have access to that.